Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. And so this episode here is serving two good purposes. One is that it will serve as a sort of cleanup for a couple of recent episodes. It will allow me to address a few things related to those episodes that have come up since, or things I've learned and, stuff like that, while also letting me sort of catch up. The other good purpose is that it will serve as a reminder, I suppose. Because this episode will address issues which, almost unbelievably, are now either out of the news cycle entirely or nearly out of it. And that annoys me. And I think it's important to bring some attention back to these events and not let them fade away quite yet. Okay, all that said, let's go. First, I want to address the aftermath of the Uvalde shooting, really more the police response in its wake. We talked about the complete and utter failure and cowardice of the police last episode, so if you're interested in, a little bit more of that angle, please check it out. I'll put a link in the description. And we also talked about some of the lies that they were telling the public. In that episode, I mentioned that if we had only heard about the lies that we had, and it was already that bad, then the actual reality would be even worse once we began to discover it. And now I don't think we have discovered the full truth here, not by a long shot, and we're going to talk about why we haven't learned it yet. But it did indeed get even worse over the ensuing weeks. So let's roll back a little bit and talk about some of the initial lies and then move forward. The cops said that the killer was confronted by a school resource officer and two police officers outside of the school before he entered, and two of the cops were injured. Literally every single aspect of that statement was a lie. Literally none of that stuff happened. No confrontations, no shootouts, no injured cops. In fact, the school resource officer just seems to have been made up out of thin air. Completely made up. The reality was that the shooter milled around for something like 12 minutes before he even entered the school. Then the police told what might be the most wild lie of the whole affair. The spokesman for these cowards got up in front of the media and told the world that a teacher had left a door propped open with a rock, which the killer used to access the school grounds. He went on to say that this teacher would have to live with the consequences of their actions for the rest of their life. Which I suppose might have been true if the teacher had indeed left the door propped open with a rock. But they didn't. They shut the door behind them when they saw a maniac with a gun coming. And now the teacher has had to hire a lawyer to protect them from the results of this accusation, which is obviously horrible. But here's the thing. In some other less heinous situation, a situation not covered by, the media as much, the word of these cops would have been taken as gospel, and this teacher's life would be ruined. Cops lie. Always have, always will. Because why not? The public puts these putzes on pedestals and just believes them and never questions them. Feared for their life when the sleeping person jumped out of bed when they kicked their door down? Good shoot, the public says, because they believe in Car 54 or something. Some Andy Griffith bullshit myth. Cops lie in court, too. They do it all the time. There's even a term for it. Test-a-lying. That's how often they do it. Sorry, I got a little sidetracked there, so back to the Uvalde lies. The police chief said that the cops were waiting for rifles because they were outgunned. Another lie. Within 3 minutes of the murders starting, there were cops on scene in the school with rifles. When they said they had to wait for ballistic shields, that was another lie. They got their first shields about 11 minutes after it started. So now, even if those things weren't lies, They had rifles and shields about 11 minutes after the murdering began. So what explains the almost an hour wait after that point? Cowardice is the only thing. Cowardice and the unerring belief that they'd all get it passed from the public, but more importantly, also the law. The police also said that they had a barricaded subject in the school, and that's why they couldn't go in. They also suggested that they did not believe that anyone was left alive in the rooms that the shooter occupied. The barricade, now think about that word and what you picture in your head. I don't know, desks piled up, a door nailed shut, a barricade, a barrier preventing you from going somewhere. Yeah, that's not what they had here. What they had was a classroom door which was supposedly locked. A locked door. Or at least the cops said the door was locked. More on that in a moment. A locked door is something that the cops deal with all the time, and it can be solved with a hard kick, or breaking a window and reaching in, or, just finding the fattest cop in the hall and throwing him through the door. So many ways to open a locked door, to stop the person inside from murdering children. So many ways. But they instead chose to wait for someone to find a key. As gunshots rang and children bled out on the other side of the somehow impervious door, they waited for a key. And it reminds me a little bit of the Die Hard movie, where the cops are trying to break into the Nakatomi building, and they try, picking the lock, cutting it with a torch, and finally they try ramming it with an armored car. But if you watch the scene, you'll notice that the doors and the entire wall on both sides are entirely made of glass. A rock would have worked. But that's, Keystone Cops for the big screen. Incompetence to serve a plot point. A lot of people don't even notice this when they watch because, it's a movie. So who gives a shit, right? But these Uvalde cowards were complicit in the same sort of performative excess, waiting for goddamn keys when there were a dozen easier ways in. They just got scared. And oh, but wait a second. I said there'd be more on the locked door later. Well, it turns out that the door wasn't actually locked. The DPS chief just testified that the door could not be locked from the inside, that it was not in fact locked, and that the cowards in the hallway never even tried to turn the goddamn knob. They never even tried. At least those cops in Die Hard gave it a shot. Just another lie on the massive pile of lies. It's just what cops do. And this is all real, guys. And the part about believing the children were dead was also a lie. They were receiving 911 calls from inside the class the whole time that their cowardly asses sat around in the hall doing nothing. The teacher who was shot several times and left for dead but survived even said that the cops told the kids to yell out if they needed help. Unfortunately, one of these children was unaware that cops are degenerate, incompetent morons and trusted them, and they yelled out for help. And then the shooter went back into that room and shot the child. And the cops continued to do nothing. In fact, the only cop who seemed willing to go confront the shooter was the off-duty husband of one of the teachers who had been shot, and she had called the officer from the classroom. He arrived with his gun, ready to save her life, but he was actually stopped, detained, and disarmed by the other cops who were there. How about that? Now, something I was thinking about is this. How does this cop go back to work in that police force full of the cowards who were too scared to save his wife, and then too sniveling and cowering to allow him to save her himself, and maybe even stop the rest of the killing? How do you look those people in the eye? How do any of his fellow cops ever look him in the eye? Can you imagine that? Running into a building with an active shooter where, your wife has told you she's been shot, and you go in and you see all your buddies, all of the roided out, power-tripping loser dorks who've been talking all badass for their whole careers while beating down people who legally and literally cannot fight back, and you roll in with your gun, and they grab you and disarm you, and then they let your wife bleed in that classroom because they were cowards. It's sad as hell, but this is what cops do every day to civilians and citizens. That it happened to a cop is just irony at this point, I guess. That song 911 is a Joke by P.E. just got TikToked into the song Cops Are a Joke by Uvalde PD. Cops should just be better people, but they aren't. And I want to point out something else. The cops in Uvalde had undergone intensive school shooter drills just 2 months before, part of which took place in this particular school. Here are some of the things that this training said. Quote, "The short duration and high casualty rates produced by these events requires immediate response to reduce the loss of life. In many cases, that immediate response means a single solo officer response until such times as the other forces can arrive. The best hope that innocent victims have is that officers immediately move into action to isolate, distract, or neutralize the threat, even if that means one officer acting alone." End quote. And for anyone thinking, boy, that sure sounds dangerous going alone. Yeah, it sure does. I don't give a shit. The training addresses this as well. It demands that responding officers who get shot get left behind by other officers. The cops are supposed to ignore their wounded friends and push forward and engage. They are even told to bypass the wounded, crying, or screaming children and move to confront the attacker. And now, after all that, the Uvalde cops have declared two things. The first is that they are refusing to work with the investigation of what went wrong. And the chief himself, the man who refused to give the order to go in, the man who was too scared to risk the lives of cops to save baby lives, I'm not even comfortable referring to this chief as a man anymore, to be honest. The coward who refused to do anything at all is now showing his cowardice in a new way by testifying behind closed doors. And this here might be the biggest explanation of those blue line support the cops flags that you see everywhere. That blue line does not represent bravery or sacrifice or protection or duty or honor. No, it absolutely does not. What it symbolizes is the blue wall of silence, which is the manifestation of a culture built on cowardice, laziness, lies, and refusing to face consequences for their own actions or to hold anyone else wearing that shield in that uniform responsible for their actions. The blue wall of silence is why dirty cops retire with pensions, murderous cops get 6-week paid vacations, and why the LA Sheriff's Department has gangs in it. That blue line flag represents the reason why 16 cops lied following the shooting of Laquan McDonald in Chicago by Officer Van Dyke. McDonald was shot 16 times, and these 16 or more officers lied about it. From the report on that incident, quote, "The officers mischaracterized the events leading up to the McDonald shooting to thereby foster a false narrative which might offer justification for the shooting." End quote. They lied about what led up to the shooting to help justify the shooting, because the shooting was not justified. The report goes on to note that the officers lied about hearing what was said between the victim and his killer, and they made up facts to protect their fellow officer. And only 4 of these officers were actually fired. The rest remained on the force to do that same thing again. In South Carolina, a few years back, a cop murdered Walter Scott by shooting him in the back as he ran away. The officer said Scott was fighting him for his taser, which, I might add, the cop was kind enough to pick up, walk over to Scott's dead body, and drop the taser next to it, of course, because this is what cops do. And how do we know all this? Did the cop admit it? Did some other cop step up and say this is what happened? Hell no. A bystander happened to see the interaction and began to film it and caught it all on his phone. If he hadn't, the world would have believed that cop. And now, going back to Uvalde, the local police department has further revealed itself to be fully staffed by despicable human beings. You guys remember the story about the mother who went to the school to save her children, and then she got handcuffed by a cop who was, being embarrassed by her because she was more brave than he was? Her name is Angeli Gomez, and she managed to get another cop to unlock her cuffs, and then she climbed a fence and ran into the school to find and rescue her kids. Because of that defiance of the quavering, cowardly Uvalde police, and the way she embarrassed the entire police force with her act of bravery to save her own sons, she now faces harassment from that very same police force. Even worse, she has called for the firing of Police Chief Arredondo. And all of these actions, not to mention her outspokenness, has led cops to drive by her house real slow and eyeball her and her family, and, to park in sight and stare, and just generally be assholes. Even doing creepy shit like parking at the end of their street and flickering their headlights at the family while they were outside exercising. Gomez has been forced to go so far as to move away from her children, the boys she rescued when the cops refused to. And she did it just so that they wouldn't have to suffer this police harassment. This is the thin blue line, the blue wall of silence at work. Scaring a mother and her children because she called you out on your cowardice, and now you're embarrassed. She doesn't deserve this treatment. Leave her alone. This is gangster intimidation, which is fitting, I guess, since the old not quite a joke about the NYPD being the country's biggest gang. They're gangs. The Uvalde police are just another blue-clad gang policing their protection racket. And even beyond all of that, the police department has decided to stop cooperating in the investigation. Like I said before, sorry I got sidetracked there. But what prompted this was a colonel from the Texas Department of Public Safety publicly stated that the Uvalde cops made the wrong decision to wait to enter the room. And this breaks that cherished blue wall of silence. A cop dared to criticize another cop. And now those cops who were criticized will not comply. Imagine that. You let children die, and someone says that was the wrong choice, and then you turn into a peevish 5-year-old and refuse to deal with it? This is just what cops do. Because questioning another cop breaks the blue wall of silence. A sin, which in the minds of the police at least, is far, far worse than allowing children to be butchered on the other side of a door that was not even locked. Seriously. The Uvalde police have also refused to share any body cam footage from the day of the shooting. What are they hiding? How bad will this all get? It's impossible to know, but it definitely will get even worse than it is right now. I absolutely guarantee it. Now, before I move on, I want to read 2 more quotes here, lifted directly from the training that these same cops went through just 60 days before the shooting. Quote, "First responder to the active shooter scene will usually be required to place themselves in harm's way to display uncommon acts of courage to save the innocent." End quote. Not a single one of these cops did either of those things. They hid and they saved nobody. And perhaps most damning of all is this. Quote, "As first responders, we must recognize that innocent life must be defended. A first responder unwilling to place the lives of the innocent above their own safety should consider another career field. End quote. They should have considered another career field when they hit this portion of the training, because none of them were willing to place their safety above the lives of children as they were being actively murdered on the other side of an unlocked door. And every single one of them should be looking for new jobs right now, starting with their incompetent chief. And even beyond that, they shouldn't just be looking for new jobs. These people should be charged. They should be prosecuted for the crime that they committed, letting those children die. Hey everybody, I know it's kind of another heavy episode, but if you made it this far, there was obviously something here you enjoyed, so please don't forget to subscribe if you're listening on your podcast player. And don't forget to like and subscribe and click that little bell if you're on YouTube. And please don't be afraid to leave a comment. It all helps. And also please consider that this podcast does take a lot of work to put together. And in an effort to turn our labor here into a little something extra, we have a Buy Me a Coffee page where you can subscribe monthly or make a one-time donation. It's quick and easy, and you can find it at buymeacoffee.com/TribunusPlebisMedia, and there will of course be a link in the description. Thank you to all who have donated already. And now, back to the episode. Okay, let's look back on the episode we did about the Don't Say Gay bill in Florida. I'm just looking at my notes say, Don't Day Gay Bull in Florida. But, all right. So, all right. This isn't really going to revisit that whole segment directly. And I'll put a link in the description to that previous episode if you want to listen. But I do want to point out a couple of consequences of both the bigoted thinking behind this bill, the hypocrisy of it, and the, I guess, predictable end result of a law like this. So first I want to talk about some of the thinking behind it, the othering, which I've kind of dipped into in that other episode and previous episodes. It's like this difference in people is noticed. Right? You're straight and gay and cis and trans or whatever. And all the morons out there, they get uncomfortable. They see it, they mark it, it makes them feel weird. And then, you know what happens? Politicians move in, talking heads move in, and they point out that, hey, these people, maybe a little different than some other people. And they feed off of that uncomfortableness, and they turn it into fear. And then they accuse and they blame those other people for the fear. They connect it to all sorts of other real issues across the country. Abused children, pedophilia, rape, grooming. And then they criminalize it. Not those bad things. Those things are already illegal. And literally nobody but deeply sick people disagree with things like pedophilia, rape, and grooming being illegal. What they actually criminalize is that difference in people. They criminalize the minority, basically. Guys who like sleeping with other guys, other them, blame them, criminalize them, lock them up, kill them. That's the path. It's a well-worn path even. And they hide it all behind save the children, right? Because nobody is against saving the children. Unless you live in Ohio. Hey everybody, I'm just jumping in here to tell you something that I just learned right as I was about to upload this. I was searching for something totally different, and it turns out that the Ohio legislature has decided, actually like a week or two ago, to remove the genital inspection aspect of this bill. So it's a little embarrassing, but I'm going to leave this in there because I think it's really important, even though everything I'm about to say is at least partially wrong because they're removing that language from the bill, that it was in there and it made it through the Ohio House. And I think it's really important to still talk about this, to understand what they tried to do and what they only fixed because of, I guess, the fighting back against it when it kind of went public. And I'm just going to let the episode play out from here. I really try my best not to, put any fake information out there. So I did want to put this note there. But I also, like I said, I feel like it's important to talk about this stuff, to realize what they tried to do, what they did do, and also the reasons why they're dialing it back. And we can't rest on our laurels because of stuff like this. Even if they take all of that language out, they tried to put it in, and they will try again. And so other than that, I apologize for that, but back to the episode. And you're a wackadoo Republican, I guess. Because the Ohio House just recently passed a bill which would require an inspection of children's genitals, both externally and internally, to establish their gender if that gender is questioned. So if a 13-year-old trans girl is on a girls' soccer team and some wine mom or loser dad challenges this, then the girl would be subjected to having her genitals examined, against her will, by an adult if she wanted to play sports in that state. So think about how sick that is for a minute. And if you're transphobic, or you just don't get it yet, consider this. A biological girl is on the same team, but she tends to wear pants and has a short haircut, and some other booze-demented wine mom from, the suburbs, she decides that this kid looks just a little bit masculine and challenges her gender. Well, they get the same unwanted genital exam that the trans person would get. Or if you had a son who had long hair and maybe they dye it purple or something, and some brain-scrambled dork dad decides that he looks a little too femme and challenges his gender, then he would be required as well to submit to having an adult inspect his genitals to continue playing. According to the Ohio High School Athletic Association, there is currently a single trans athlete in the entire state. That's how twisted these sociopaths are about someone who just wants to live a normal life and play a little bit of sports. And please spare me the bullshit about whatever fairness in sports argument you've concocted or heard on YouTube. We both know it's BS, and that none of you gave a shit about field hockey before these monsters tried to turn trans kids into political pawns and scare stories. None of this is okay. This is just some sick, transphobic terrorism at play in this weird-ass state. And it's going to continue into a broader context across this whole country if we don't do something to stop it. And the final part of this is, which is just one of the most feared aspects of not just these laws, but just the broader thinking and othering and just fascistic bullshit that goes into it all. It happened in Texas. Governor Greg Abbott, scumbag extraordinaire, had issued a directive which required child abuse investigations of anyone who was found to be providing gender-affirming care for their children in the state. First of all, it declared any such gender-affirming care as abuse, as in literally all of it is abuse. Parental choice, right out the window pretty quick, right? Thought they believed in that. Of course they don't. Of course they don't. They're just using that for political leverage. This directive, it required all health professionals to report gender-affirming care, aka supposed abuse, under criminal penalty. The state interfering with doctors, by the way. Something else these people are against until they aren't. The requirement is also imposed upon the general public, also with criminal liabilities hanging over their heads. So if Susie Homemaker overhears someone say that their child is trans, they are supposed to report them for an abuse investigation by protective services. And I don't want to get too into the weeds with, gender-affirming care here, because I'm so far from an expert on it that it would be criminal to pretend to be, something I'm not. But it does include things like puberty blockers, which are really helpful for trans people. Hopefully, I can speak on this more properly in the future, but until then. So anyway, one of the side effects that people talked about, and which I believe I mentioned in the previous episode, is that this sort of stuff could be directly harmful to young people and perhaps even lead to self-harm. And by this stuff, I mean laws like this, not gender-affirming care. Gender-affirming care saves lives. Bills like this take lives. And in Texas, it did just that after the parents of a Texas teen were reported to child services for helping their child by allowing them to be prescribed hormone blockers. When the teen learned about the investigation and what it could mean, either their parents getting in trouble or losing access to their gender-affirming health care, they tried to take their own life. And that family is now suing the state and Abbott over the law. And what I want to kind of emphasize here is that this is not a mistake. It's not really a side effect either, even though I think I used that term a while back. I shouldn't have. It makes it sound incidental or something. The reality is that this is exactly what people like Abbott and the people who are pushing these sorts of directives and laws and bills want. They want these people to conform or to die. They want them to deny themselves or to die. They want them to live in shame and hiding and under a blind of falseness, or they want them dead. That's it. Because they don't understand trans or LGBTQ stuff more generally, and they hate it. Whether it's fear or political pressure or biblical nonsense, they hate these people. They'll scream about groomers and then force young children to get their genitals examined at the whims of inebriated soccer moms and idiot dads whose last good moment was in high school badminton, just to play a meaningless youth league soccer game that shouldn't be anything more than a fun time out with friends. They demand parents' rights, except when they hate children for who they are at their very core. They are pro-life, unless it's a gay life, or queer life, or trans life. These deaths and the pressures which lead to them, they are choices. And these lawmakers are making those choices, and they know what the results will be. They are fully aware. They are either cheering these deaths, or they just don't give a shit. And because the difference in these two stances is little more than semantic, these people are all evil. And that's it for today, guys. That's the episode. It feels like it was a little bit of a short one. It took a while to get it out, I know, and I apologize. But if you like what we do here at Tribunus Plebis, please consider subscribing wherever you're watching or listening, whether it's on your podcast or your YouTube. Like the video, comment. We have Buy Me a Coffee page, buymeacoffee.com/TribunusPlebisMedia. There's a link in the description. You can either make a one-time donation or sign up monthly. Any and all help is really appreciated. These episodes do take a lot of work to do. And thank you for considering it. I think that's it. I love you guys. Bye.